Actually, Olive, would you summarise your experience? It's on the papers, but it would be lovely if you could do that. So, Olive.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I've got a background in general nursing as well as mental health nursing, and immediately after qualifying as a mental health nurse way back in the very early 80s, I think it was 1980, I worked for a while in adolescent and child mental health, and later on, amongst many other things I did, I worked for Professor Rutter at the Institute of Psychiatry as a researcher, and I did a lot of I was involved with quite a lot of big studies looking at mental health in young people. So I've had an interest in this area for a long time. My more recent academic role has been around being a lecturer at a university, also doing some research, and my PhD was really based on dual diagnosis, which is the overlap of mental health problems and addiction or substance misuse. And I've worked in the substance misuse area clinically for quite a long time. So I guess that's enough about me, really. So I'll get on with my presentation. The title today is Young People's Mental Health, the Policy Perspective. Okay. Just trying to find a way of shifting these slides. Hang on. Yeah, I think I've got it. Yeah. Svetlana, yes, thank you. Thank you. I couldn't get the slides to move for some reason. The button that I can usually see isn't there. So the first section of the presentation is the current context. So please, Svetlana. I'm looking at some sort of very basic stats and the kind of general UK picture. Poor mental health among children and young people is often described as an epidemic and something like an escalating crisis. So there is an element of quite a lot of concern. The number of children seeking help from child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS in England, has more than doubled in recent years. The proportion of under 16-year-olds experiencing any mental disorder has risen from 11.4% in 1999 to 13.6% in 2017. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't look like a huge rise. The percentage of under 16-year-olds with depression or anxiety disorders has increased from 3.9% in 2004 to 5.8% in 2017. Next slide, please, Svetlana, if you can. A little bit more about the current context. So what we see is that there's a significant gap between the number of children found to have had a diagnosable mental health problem and the number of referrals that are made to CAMS services. This suggests a significant proportion of the increase in referrals is due to the fact that more people, maybe young people in some cases, or parents, actually being unwell or perceiving themselves as being unwell. Self-reported conditions among young people increased sixfold in England, doubled in Scotland, and increased by more than half in Wales between 1999 and 2014. In England, there's also been an almost doubling of hospital admission for self-harm amongst girls. Self-harm amongst boys is a much lower prevalence. This has happened since 1997. But as I said, there's a big difference with the stats there between boys and girls. Next slide, please, Svetlana, if you can. Sorry, it should have been 3. Yes, thank you. 1 in 8, or 12.8% of 5 to 19-year-olds has at least one mental disorder when assessed in 2017. Emotional disorders were the most prevalent type of disorder experienced in 2017, so that's 8.1%. And rates of mental disorders increased with age, with 5.5% between in 2 to 4-year-olds, whereas it's 16.9% of 17 to 19-year-olds. So the picture gets worse as young people get older. The percentage of young people aged 5 to 15-year-olds with depression or anxiety also increased from 3.9% in 2004 to 5.8% in 2017. Again, on the face of it, not a very big rise. Emotional disorders have become common in 5 to 15-year-olds. And again, there's been an increase overall in that group. All other types of disorders, such as behavioural disorders, hyperactivity, and other less common disorders, have shown a similar prevalence. Next slide, please, Svetlana. Thank you. So, what's really important is that we know that half of mental ill health and health problems start by the time somebody is 15 years old, and 75% of mental health problems that people experience develop by the time somebody is 18 years old. And that's a well-established trend that we've seen. 12.8% of young people aged 5 to 15 to 19-year-olds meet clinical criteria for a mental disorder. And about 20% of young people with mental ill health have to wait at least 6 months for a referral to a specialist. And there's been a lot of work, and government have made a lot of noises about improving this. About 10% of young people aged 8 to 15 years experience a low sense of well-being. And only 1 in 8 children who've been sexually abused come to the attention of agency. So we know that sexual abuse is one of those traumas that often gets missed because of the low level of reporting. Up to 25% of teenagers have experienced physical violence in their intimate partner relationships. So people are actually experiencing domestic violence even in their teens. And in an average classroom, 10 children will have witnessed their parents separate or have experienced severe physical violence, sexual abuse, neglect, and will have experienced the death of a parent, and 7 will have been bullied. So next slide, please, Svetlana. Suicide in young people, despite having a low number of deaths overall in young people, the statistics for females aged 10 to 24 years old since 2012 has increased by 83%, and that's from 1.8 deaths per 100,000 to 3.3 in 2018. So that's a huge increase there, even though the mental health diagnoses haven't increased on the face of it as much as this huge increase in this really serious area. Next slide, please. So the policy context. Next, please. The 2010 to 15 coalition government committed to improving health for children, and as part of its commitment of achieving parity of esteem between physical health and mental health. You'll probably have heard of the No Health Without Mental Health strategy, which pledged to provide early support for mental health problems, and the strategy Closing the Gap, again, prioritising for change and improve services and to improve access to psychological therapies for young people. The Department of Health, NHS England, established a Children and Young People's Mental Health and Wellbeing Task Force, which reported in March 2015, and the title of that report is Future in Mind, and this set out ambitions and plans for improving care over the next 5 years. Next slide, please, Svetlana. Okay, subsequently, in 2015, the government committed to implementing the recommendations in the 5-year forward view for mental health, including specific objectives to improve treatment for children and young people by 2020-21. So if that's carried out effectively, we should start to see improvements around that, well, this year and next year. The 2015-2017 government announced new funding for mental health, including specific investment in perinatal services and eating disorder services for teenagers. And the Policing and Crime Act 2017 included provisions to end the practice of children and young people being kept in police cells as a place of safety while awaiting mental health assessment or treatment. Next slide, please. In December 2017, a green paper on children and young people's health was published for consultation, which set out measures to improve mental health support, and in particular through schools and colleges. This green paper set out 3 key proposals: to incentivise and support all schools and colleges to identify and provide a designated lead for mental health; to fund new mental health support teams, which will be supervising children and young people's mental health staff, and to pilot a 4-week waiting time for access to specialist NHS child and young people's mental health services. So 4 very distinct plans there to improve things. Next slide, please. The government's response to the consultation published in July 2018 committed to taking forward all proposals in the Green Paper, with certain areas trialling the 3 key proposals in 2019. And the NHS long-term plan, published in 2019, restated the government's commitment to deliver the recommendations in the 5-year forward view for mental health, and set forth measures to improve the provision and access to mental health services for children and young people. The Department of Education first published statutory RSE and health education guidance in June 2019, and this is scheduled to come into force in September 2020, so very soon, supposedly. The guidance sets out requirements for health education, and this must cover physical health and mental well-being. Next slide, please. So the future, in light of the policy and the data. Next slide, please. So overall, the available data point to there being a significant disparity between young people's, perhaps parents' perceptions of their mental health problems and diagnosable illness. Now, one interpretation of this is young people and parents feel distressed and worried, and that more emotional forms of support is needed for both children and parents, rather than there being an actual increase in hardcore psychiatric illness. Just because something isn't diagnosable according to the diagnostic categorizations doesn't mean that people aren't suffering. I'd be very interested to see what others thought about this interpretation, or what other interpretations there might be. So what other possible interpretations do you guys think there is for this disparity between the diagnosable mental illnesses and the level of self-referral or requests for referral by children and young people? Because the two are miles apart. One of the main strategies being offered by the government is provision of counselling and other services in schools. This may, in my opinion, help to some degree, but much depends on the quality and the accessibility of counselling, which remains to be seen. It is conceivable, and I am worried, that this may not provide anything more than a sticking plaster, and maybe have a similar effect as the increasing access to psychological therapies or IAP services, which have been regarded as largely like a sticking plaster and overall not effective. So I have a question to you guys to think about here as well. How effective is the proposed provision of counselling services in schools likely to be? Now, I have some references on the next slide, which we need to share now. But if we're sharing files, of course, you'll have access to all of this presentation. I'd like very briefly, if I have time, Svetlana, to say that the core statistics the government publishes don't routinely include adolescent or young people's substance misuse. And they don't include routinely statistics on the Asperger's and autism spectrum disorder. And they don't include statistics on bullying per se. So all the statistics are interesting. It concerns me in a way that they're probably quite incomplete and don't paint a complete picture. Now, in terms of substance misuse, and this is a very crude figure, but overall, about 44% of teenagers at school report drinking alcohol at some point, and 24% of teenagers at school report using drugs of some sort at some point. So those sort of behaviours, maybe smoking as well, drinking and drug use, and perhaps gambling, and perhaps being dependent on computer games, etc., may contribute to the distress that young people and their parents are concerned about. But there's a whole raft of areas that seem to fall outside of the usual standard reporting of these problems. And that's something that perhaps people don't understand immediately. And I think that there's a huge glaring gap there, that something needs to be addressed about that. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand you back to Svetlana now. Christine.
Thanks very much, Olive. There were many important questions that you raised in your presentation, and I've made also a note to myself. I can see that Christine has also put a question in the chat box. I guess we will address these substantive questions in the panel discussion at the end. But if anybody has any question of clarification at the moment, please put them into the box. Otherwise, we will move on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Olive. And the next presenter is Dr. Anne Duke. Now, Anne was given an honorary doctorate in philosophy by London Metropolitan University in 2016 to recognise her pioneering work as a visionary practitioner. I've worked with her for a long time. She's a very humble person, but she's going to talk about her vision for combining the use of theatre and drama to address social issues arising from young people's own narratives, with providing so-called alternative education for vulnerable students who have rejected mainstream education, and combining that with a therapeutic approach, with providing counselling support for the same young people and providing training in counselling. So Anne, if we pass over to you.
Hi, yeah, I hope you can all hear me okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Svetlana, for putting up the first slide. As Christine said, I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, and I speak purely from that perspective. I've been working with disadvantaged and community setting for about 20 years, and I founded the charity Walk Tour to help people really to fulfill using, as Christine said, education, performing arts, and mental health interventions. These are some of our projects. So, all-age counselling service, and I'm very interested in what Olive was saying earlier, statistically. Education and training initiatives, which I'll talk more about, and also our integrated projects, arts, education, and a therapeutic approach. Would you please, Svetlana, just do the next slide for me, I think. What I'm going to do is take a brief look at the work of Walk Tool and how we work with young people, and how our model evolved, some of the key difficulties our young people face, and then maybe give some examples of the work in practice. The charity was founded in 2002, operates in Dartford and Gravesham boroughs of Kent mainly, although our arts does have a county reach. I started the charity initially to help primary school children to cope with bullying, but quickly found that actually bullying was just one symptom of a much deeper social issue. Now, in those days, Walk Tool just used drama with some quick-to-use communication and self-development tool thrown in. We'd also always use devised drama, and it was always drawn from children's real experiences. This actually proved to be a very emotionally, mentally safe way to build confidence, social skills, bond the group, as well as a great way to deal with feelings, because the issues using drama, using acting, can be depersonalized. At the end of each session, we'd always share their devised pieces, and we'd interrupt with points of learning to explore things like communication, positive and negative consequences, and so on. I think now this approach is pretty standard, but actually it wasn't then. Now, we started taking our projects into primary and secondary schools. We began to come across fragile young people, anxious young people who have complex lives and mental health needs that definitely were not being met. They tended to be quiet, not challenging. They didn't get noticed, and very often they just dropped out of school. Now, we introduced mentoring, one-to-one counselling, and then Key Stage 4 and 5 alternative education programs. And this was to support this fragile group. Lots of provision out there for challenging behaviours, improves, but not for these anxious, withdrawn young people. Now, some of our young people have suffered, as in common with what we have just heard from Olive, early trauma, neglect, so absent parenting, hunger. Some have been the victims of physical and sexual abuse from preschool age. And now we're seeing an increasing number of young people who are so overprotected that their parents become collusive in their children's withdrawal, actually through life. In our education cohort this year, for instance, profile, 5% on the autistic spectrum, 30% from care system, 50% from non-working families, sometimes going back 3 generations, and there's no aspirational horizon. It's quite touching. We also have about 2% of exceptionally bright students, and they refuse school because they're scared of failure. And if they don't try, they can't. Now, the vast majority of our young people can't build or maintain relationships. That's with family, peers, or authority figures. Some are so withdrawn that they actually tend to agoraphobia, and we anticipate after lockdown it's going to be a very difficult job to actually get them back into the classroom. Our approach: relationships, relationships, relationships. Building secure relationships between staff and students is absolutely key. We prove that we can be trusted to support. Now, we develop students' self-knowledge and social knowledge. I call it psychosocial therapeutic education. I don't think that's a proper term. We also provide one-to-one counselling, and we embed performance and creativity exercises across the curriculum to develop positive, confident relating skills. Oh, and as well as that, we actually do deliver on core GCSEs and get them through exams. What outcomes do we see? Well, all relationships improve across the board. They become much more secure. I think there's some repair there to the way they relate and interact with others. They become motivated to learn, to grow, and actually very proud to say that they move on to positive next steps. Over the past 7 years, 90% success, and over the last 2 years, 98%, which is fantastic. And the fabulous thing is they come back to us and they tell us all about how they're doing. Well, that's our alternative education. What I'd actually like to do now is to look at other projects that we've done, which use this 3-pronged approach of arts, education, and therapy in working with vulnerable groups. And Svetlana, may I have the next slide, please? Right, okay. Now, in 2016, 1,500 young unaccompanied asylum seekers came to Kent from the Calais jungle. Gravesend was one of 3 Kent wards of very high density asylum seeking populations, and we were asked as a charity to work with 77 young people. Our job: to teach them English, maths and British culture. The problem: they were traumatised, couldn't speak English, and so we found ourselves actually teaching in a TEFL style and delivering therapy without language. Javed is that little laddie in the middle, and I haven't got time to go into his story, but very briefly, he travelled with 2 brothers from Afghanistan. His brothers died in the Calais jungle. Now, Javid couldn't speak English. All he wanted was his mum. He didn't know where he lived in Afghanistan. And this picture captures the first time that we saw him smile. May I have the next slide, please? Lovely, thank you. Right, so moving on to what I call model. That's because that was the first school that we rolled it out in. And we were asked to work with children displaying mental ill health. Now, this was a primary school setting, and what we did was work with the children, but their parents, their siblings, grandparents, in a structure. Initially, we just worked with the adults over the and they learned basic transaction analysis and relating tools. The children and then came together, and over a period of weeks, we created a original performance. Called it Family of the World, as I recall. Now, all the relationships during that, relationships within families and abroad in other countries. The evaluation there that there was improved relationships within the participating families, between the parents and the school, and children were much less stressed, showed much more childlike behaviour, and motivated to engage in education. One of the spin-off benefits was that the parents and children would work together at home on texts and poems and all that. Actually, the literacy levels improved massively. May I have the next slide, please? Lovely, thank you. This I call therapeutic theatre in education, another label that I've put together. Now at this point, I would just like to signpost to some exciting actual research by Dr. Delia Baskerville, who we're going to hear from later. It's synergistic and it's also complementary to that we have done in therapeutic theatre and education. So this is our development of the arts education therapy model, and we've now found that we're becoming a voice for the voiceless, not only for young people but for other groups as well. What we do is work with various groups. We research their issues through sharing of their experiences, perspectives, feelings, and then we distill them into characters which are accurate representations of what's being shared. Now, we then perform them as monologues or usually as a three-hander, which is, and we do this in schools, colleges, theatres, and the walk-talk therapists are part of this team, both in input into the monologues and the scenes, as well as what follows the performance, which is either an audience discussion panel or breakout groups led by the therapists and the actors. And these explore the key points about the issues raised. Now, there are just a few here depicted on this slide. One of them is called A Matter of Honour, and that was actually about forced marriage and honour killings. The two slides at the bottom right, the asylum seeking project, and and if anything illustrates the conjoined power of arts education and the therapeutic approach. It's something that a year 10 boy said to me after one performance. He said, thank you, miss. I now know I don't have to commit suicide. There are other options. I think I'm well out of time. So thank you very much for listening. And I don't know, I think we'll take questions at the end. Is that right, Svetlana?
Yes, thank you so much, and sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, we will discuss it all at the end. So unless anybody has an urgent question of clarification, perhaps we would move to our next speaker. So this is Chris Morris Robert, Chris, would you like to say a few words about your research, or shall I introduce you?
Hi, I'm Chris Morris Roberts. My first career is podiatry, so feet was my first career, which I still am very heavily involved in for my profession. I work in the School of Social Professions, and my work basically has, over the years, has focused mainly on embodiment and how we connect with our bodies, what our bodies mean to us. My doctoral thesis was in sports sociology, so I looked at sportsmen and their bodies, and mental health became part of that. And I've been very passionate about using alternative sort of research methodologies to collect research data. So 4 years ago, I decided to go to film school, for instance, and did an MA in documentary film to find another way of collecting research data. So, for example, I did a piece of work that looked at the fear of falling in elderly people at home, and we went to their homes and filmed them in situ, embodied in their lives, talking about the fear of falling, and it totally changes the landscape of the data that you collect and how you interact with that data. So I've done a whole load of different bits and pieces, but my key focus of research is about embodiment and what our bodies mean to us. So that's me in a nutshell. My present, here we go. So that my area in this project is about health as embodiment, and there were some key areas that I felt were particularly interesting or important in this area, and that was, how I define embodiment, the use of young people and advocates, binaries in health, and the development of a shared language. So one of the jobs that I did do, I've worked at the University of East London, I've worked at the University of Brighton, became associate professor there, and then I then decided to move into a research field as well, and worked as a senior research fellow at Great Ormond Street Hospital, using innovative methods to collect research data, and I did a service evaluation and all sorts of stuff. But there was this is a little bit of self-reflection about mental health in children and young people. There was a particular group of children who have a condition called 22q, which is a genetic condition. Most people know Down syndrome, and then 22q is the second most common genetic disorder, but not many people have heard of it. And this condition is really fascinating because these children suffer with cleft palate. They suffer with learning difficulties because of the cleft palate, which then leads to speech and language problems, which then leads to significant mental health problems in children from the age of 5 or 6 years old, with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, depression. And I did one of my roles at Great Ormond Street was to look at how these children live their lives and what their lives mean to them. And I was particularly moved by the idea of children at this age suffering with issues that we don't consider children to have experienced. And it sort of totally changed my perspective of embodying children and young people and mental health. So it was quite a milestone in my career, that. So how do I define embodiment, or what is embodiment to me? So it has a strong history in philosophy and psychology, and for me personally, phenomenology is one of my key focused areas. However, there's many debates about whether you look at just the body or whether you just look at the mind. My background is in phenomenological theory, and so the language of the lived experience and how we live in our body and what our bodies mean to us. And every single person and every young person's experience of a condition is individual to them and it's unique to them, but there are shared interpretations that we can take from those experiences when we listen and understand that through research that can be shared to a larger audience. So then my approach is that there's a strong relationship between the mind and the body. That duality, I don't feel like you can pull those apart particularly well. And so I feel like it's really important when you exist in a body, that you understand what that means to you and the young person or whoever this might be. So my work has looked at sort amputation. I've looked at children with cerebral palsy and how they experience play, 22q mental health, shoes, people with lower limb pathology, the politics of the body, dysmorphia, child anxiety, the list goes on. And so I really enjoyed what this sort of exploration of mental health, which embodiment means, and how I could potentially link that to mental health in this project. So often embodiment is not studied directly as we are going to research embodiment, and it's often a theme that is sort of kicked out at the side. And what I think is really interesting about this project is that embodiment is a key theme in the project, so it's not something that's just sort of an add-on. So I think that's a really good bonus to this project. A very important part of this is about advocates and young people, and particularly at Great Ormond Street Hospital when I was working there, is that there's this very strong message that children are not small adults, they're their own people. And so when you design research or engage with research, particularly in this case with mental health, you have to engage those that are wanting to engage, that you engage the research on their terms and through their understanding. And at Great Ormond Street, we did work where children as young as 4 or 5 were engaged in research, because the research was designed with them in mind and with their sort of approach to the research. So they were advocates in designing the work. And, it's in this approach, empowering young people to be employed in the research is particularly important. And so part of this as well, when you have young people designing the research and being part of it, is that I believe parents are fundamental to be tied into that, because they know their children very well. Move on to the next slide. So what a complicated part of embodiment and living in the bodies we live in is society is built up on binaries. So that is sort of example here, male, female, you're happy or you're sad, it's good or it's bad, it's ill health or you're healthy, gay, straight. Whenever these things happen, particularly in mental health, for example, they cause political and power imbalances. So someone is always disenfranchised in these experiences. And it's very important to pick those binaries apart between the labels, and this comes on to my next slide, that relates to the language that is used in defining mental health, for example. And often there's this dichotomy between people like labels for mental health issues, and then other people don't like labels, because once you're put in that bracket, there's no way of getting out of it. Other people find relief having a label because they understand why they're in the context they are and how they've lived that experience. And parents are very heavily involved in defining and understanding that language of diagnosis and living through an experience of mental health. And this links very closely to like the self-concept theory, where because how you understand yourself and how you might understand a condition might lead to erosion of positive messages that you've had as well, which can then impact on your self-image. So embodiment becomes really a complicated issue, I find, between how you live that experience, how those around you share that experience, but mainly it's about the person themselves, or the young person, how they live that. So key themes here could be mental health, socioeconomics, BAME, body risk, and this links to sexuality and sex. And what I think is really important over the work over the years is about shared language, because often I've worked in different disciplines where I pulled stuff from fashion, sociology, psychology, podiatry. Sometimes the language is very different, and this allows us to have a sort of interdisciplinary approach. It helps us to think creatively about that language. We can then touch on intersectionality, and it helps researchers, educators, the advocates involved to have a language that we all understand, and it makes the work accessible. And I'm very passionate about work that I do becoming accessible for those that are reading it or engaged in it. And then And when you think of embodiment, it's often, I think you have to take very, you can have the traditional approaches of interviews and semi-structured interviews and ethnography, but I think using innovative approaches, which we use in this group, such as ethno-drama, I think music, creative writing, and film and self-interpretation of self could be a really important fundamental part of the approaches that we take in this project, potential project to move forward. That's my time up. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris, for this fascinating talk, and we'll address questions to you at the end.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Delia Baskerville, who works in New Zealand and in the Victoria University in Wellington. Now, Delia, would you like to say a few words about yourself, your research, your history? Would be very nice.
Thank you. First of all, greetings from a little town called Waikanae on the Kapiti Coast in the just north of Wellington in the North Island of New Zealand, where it is currently nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. So I just ask that you bear with me. I've got a little bit of technology to do as well. So I am a trained primary teacher, a trained actress, a secondary drama teacher, and a teacher educator, just as a brief synopsis. But before I get into what I'm saying, I'd just like to thank Christine for inviting me to be part of this project. And I would like to just perhaps position my research a little bit and talk about why I got into truancy research. Personally, I have been an outsider both as a child and an adult. I'm an immigrant to New Zealand. I was actually born in Plaistow in London, and my family were 10-pound Poms who came to New Zealand in the 50s. And as an adult, I was excluded from society when I lived on a state benefit for a while. So that was the personal, but there are three projects that led me into looking at truancy. Firstly, when I've been teaching drama in a secondary community college for about 8 years, I realised that Māori students weren't attending my classes. Now, these are the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. And I quickly realised that was about me rather than about them. So that I needed to go and get some professional development, which I did. I went and got some Marae-based theatre development for 3 months, where we devised theatre around students' first hurt stories. And this was with Jim Moriarty's theatre company. So I first saw the power of storytelling, and I also realised the importance of hui, which was the discussion post-performance when the community members spoke to the cast directly about the issues that were presented. The second project that informed this was when I went and worked in a youth prison, and I did a week's work, and I left with a very strong heart burden about the fact that there was only one outcome for these youth, and that was Big Boys Prison. So I came home and talked to my son, and he enlightened me and said it all starts with truancy. So a seed was planted there. Thirdly, I went, after coming into the North Island to work as a Ministry of Education advisor implementing the arts curriculum, I went to Griffith University to do my master's, and part of that was a 3-week residency. And we looked at ethnodrama, and 3 of us went out in the streets of Brisbane in the middle of the night and interviewed homeless people. And with that, we wrote the ethnodrama and performed it as an examination for our lecturers. And the moment that was just so powerful for me was when I was performing 3 feet away from a woman who had told me her story, and the tears were streaming down her face. And I realized the healing power of ethnodrama, as well as the power as an actress of telling a story, an authentic story. So I started on my PhD, and I entered a new field. I did not know the field of truancy, but I identified a gap in my proposal of student voice. A lot of head teachers, research from schools, but very little from students. And what was there, the students' and parents' voice contradicted the teacher voice. So I wanted to delve deeper and look under the skin of truancy. And so I started a grounded theory analysis of student interviews, and this is the theory that emerged. Now you'll see it's a process theory of wagging, and wagging is the prevalent term that the young people used when they were describing truancy. Now you see also that this theory has 4 stages. I'll just click on to something if I can find it. Yes, I can. So you can see that wagging began in class. And this was about when the young people detached from teachers, peers, and learning. The second stage, leaving, had 2 components: absconding and mattering. Now, absconding was about all those circumstances, situations, and problems the students faced, the obstacles, both at home and school, that prevented them from wanting to go to school. But this part here, for me, was a wonderful part of the theory. When the young people left class and went outside, they found a social group. Now, this social group, they gathered together and they listened to one another's stories. They were respected. Others were kind to them. And they were treated in a way that they weren't being treated in class. They had a sense of belonging and they mattered to one another. The third part of the theory, or third stage, awakening, was when the students found situations where they realized there wasn't a future in truancy for them, and they started to turn, but they could only do it when they had agency, support from adults, and they had that support to turn to go back to school, or else if they did not have the adult support, they exited. Then the final stage is the re-including stage. Now there's 2 components to this: accommodating and willing. Now this is about the fact that teachers need to accommodate students coming back from after wagging, and the students have to be ready and willing to re-engage with school. So thank you. Could you remove that slide, please? So what I want to do now is I actually want to play you some video clips, and this will be
now it's really open to our very talented audience, because we have so much experience, and I wonder if people would like to type out some questions, some specific questions, and we'll try and have a panel approach to that. But also feel free to make some comments from your own specialist areas. So is there anyone who would like to? So Patricia O'Lynn, if you would say something.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this initiative. I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job, and I'm just so excited that we're in a space where we can have these conversations. My work, as you said, Christine, is examining young people's experiences of school exclusion. It's not entirely divorced from what Delia does when she's looking at truancy. It's something that I've been struck by in my research, in my practice, as I work in the education sector and I'm also an elected representative, is that I'm starting to believe, whenever I look at the structures and take a sociological perspective to my work, that people might feel and say that they are trying to work to the betterment of society and to improve the life outcomes of young people, particularly those with mental health issues. But I think when we take a step back and we actually look at the state of play, they're doing no such thing. And I think the idea of categorization, of labeling, of positioning of young people is so important, because who is looking at the structures? Who is looking at the fundamentally broken systems that our young people are moving through, and us as practitioners are trying to support them in? So it was really thought-provoking, and I'm just really keen to stay part of this conversation moving forward. And thanks so much for having me.
So thank you very much. Delia Baskerville. I think you wanted to respond, Delia. I'm not sure. So, can we have a comment, please, from Sandy Smith? Sandy, if you're ready, and could you tell us about your work, Sandy? If you unmute. And
yes. Hi, thank you. I don't know if you can see me. Yes, so we've spoken to groups of young people about mental health, and particularly we spoke to groups of young people in excluded groups, so gypsies and travellers, young offenders, people that had just left care, and we talked to them about their experiences of services and what it was like seeking help, and what it was that they actually wanted to help them. Basically, it really fitted with what we thought we might hear. So I think young people are so underestimated, and they want to help each other, and I think being seen as a resource, not a problem, and seeing all of this work today is so interesting, because this is so much empowerment, and these are exactly the sort of things that I think that the young people were talking about. But something that I was just actually going to respond to what Patricia said was also what young people have told us, is that the current structures that we're working with, so the academisation, commissioning, and the voluntary sector being pressured for funding, really does make such a really fragmented system, and there's so much gatekeeping around, which completely opposes the idea of empowerment and hinders how young people's voices are heard. So that was kind of like my view, following up very much from what you said, Patricia. Is that helpful?
That's really helpful. Could Aine come in, because Aine has done. Can you tell us about your new MSc Youth and Community Work course, please, Anya?
Oops.
You okay?
Yeah, I'd muted myself. Yeah, thanks, Christine. Yeah, we've managed to recently validate the new MSc for youth and community work here at the university. And I think the curriculum very much has been led by feedback from practitioners in the field. And I draw my own experience as a youth worker, where I started years ago in Belfast. And a lot of my work would have been with young people, you know, in terms of their experience of political conflict and the communities that they were living in. So, you know, I would have started out very young, engaged in young people with group work, and I would have used theatre as well. And more recently, a lot of the work that I would have involved as a practitioner with mainly like girls and young women, particularly around rape, survivors of rape, sexual abuse, etc. And looking and considering, again, the diagnosis of young people who will be labelled as being bipolar, etc. But in fact, it's trauma. And this is kind of how I wanted to lead the new MSc, where there's quite a focus on trauma, mental health and well-being of our young people. And that's very much, again, looking at those who are on the front line of intervention, and also those who are supporting our workers on that front line of intervention. And, you know, the whole idea of dispelling the labels and the myths. And something that I've had in my practice for a long time is around voice and participation, and, you know, look beyond the behaviour. You know, what is it, the behaviour, and how we label behaviour as being disruptive or aggressive or hard to manage, etc. Where in fact that we need to be looking, at the focus, sort of the causes of the behaviour, and then the focus that becomes the focus of the interventions. So yeah, we're very excited about the new course, and we've got some key ideas. And again, I think what's important is the curriculum, as I said, has been led very much by practitioners and from our students who were involved in our youth work course. In fact, 2 of our students are here today, ex-students. I think Aaron, if you're still here, works now with Red Thread, which is a youth intervention program, and he's a hospital youth worker, if I'm correct on that one, Aaron. And he does a lot of work around referral and listening to those young people who arrive in hospital with the stabbings and knife wounds, guns, etc., gunshots. And also Charmaine is here as well, and work that they're doing in, with the early years and young people, intervention, family work, and support work. So I think this workshop couldn't have come at a better time, Christine. So thank you so much, and all the contributions. It just continues to feed our thoughts and our approaches to the work. And myself and Sandra Vassiani, I think Sandra was here. We did quite a few conferences here at the university, and a workshop that I had was about 50 organisations in the Pan London who are working with young people, and we brought them all together. And the day was for the workers, and to talk about their support and what's there to support, and sometimes to enable practitioners to make sense of what's going on. So yeah, thanks for that, Christine. But it's it's a very exciting time in terms of, at long last, we're getting recognition in terms of, for me, there's 2 sides: undiagnosed mental health, young people are labelled and mislabelled, and then the over-labelling. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Delia, you've had your hands up for a while, so can
Yes,
you
I think the power of the partnership between our team was quite stunning in terms of, I stood up in Wanhui and said, without realising, that the school system was broken and there was work to be done. And the power of having a practitioner in the classroom, an academic who's done the research, and the students being the change agents is really remarkable. When I started out on this research, my goal was to privilege the voices of these young people who didn't speak in their families, and they're now in leadership roles. The year 12s have become year 13s and they're in leadership roles with schools. So I totally agree with what you're saying, and this is a much needed time, and I do think that there's methodologies here that could have a synergy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Patricia, you've got your hand up. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to pick up on what Anya was saying there. I think it was really, I live in Northern Ireland. We're in this sort of like time at the minute where trauma has become sort of like popularized, and everybody is saying, oh, it's trauma, but people aren't going to the practices that help to combat traumatic experiences and the behaviours that lead from it. But I'm really interested to hear other people's perspectives as to whether or not the systems that our young people enter, i.e. education, i.e. health, contribute to their ill mental health. I mean, from my 5 years working on the front line in school exclusion centres, from what I could see, the system was actually sparking and triggering those traumas. And I would argue quite strongly we're creating the conditions for mental health to plummet. But instead of recognising that, we go to the deficit approach, we go to the young person's behaviours, we put them to the psychiatrist who assesses them against the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, which changes every 5 years and is wholly debatable. So there's no emphasis on the structures, and if there is, we teacher bash and we teacher blame, or we bring it down to resources whenever there's some organisations are doing great work on place-based change or collective impact approaches to plug in the gaps in the system. And like Anya, I'm sure you're aware, but North Belfast is a part of Northern Ireland where there's millions of pounds pumped in every year, and it
Yeah.
bleeds through the system. So when are we going to stop and start privileging professional knowledge and expertise to actually benefit the young people who we're trying to help? Wait, I think I just went off on a rant, so I'm going to turn my microphone off now, but thank you.
No, thanks, Patricia. Can I just come back a little bit, Christine, or Patricia? I totally agree with you. That whole structural inequality and looking at the personal and the cultural and how it all interlinks. And I think one of the conferences we had about 2 years ago, I wanted the focus to be around redressing the public narrative and how we problematize young people. And what we were trying to do is, let's get away from all young people are in gangs, etc. We need to get away from that. We need to look at the resources, the systemics, what is around young people, what's there to prevent, or how can we actually support young people a lot more rather than at the whole labelling process. So I agree with you totally, Patricia.
Yes, there's a great deal of work in educational research around, especially in secondary schools, the exam factory, the sort of ramping up of the performance pressure for everyone, and the way that impacts on professionals within the system. There's a lot of counter research. Kathleen Lynch in Dublin has done a lot of work on care as a form of structural social justice, as a kind of balance that can be applied. I've looked at head teachers who are trying to manage this as contested but neoliberal environment in which the imperatives are there, and they're trying to protect spaces for care to occur, for the arts. It's very interesting to see how they might do that. So there's been a great deal in this thread about a broken system. Would anyone else like to, on that theme, make any comment? So Anne, yes.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, Christine, did you say me?
Yes, I did, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's just that. I mean, I totally agree with what Patricia is saying. It's what I see every day. And I think that young people, we know right from the get-go, respond to their environment, whether that's their parents or carer. This is straight attachment, isn't it, right at the start. And so they respond, they learn about how to work with the world from the responses they're given. Okay, so if young people respond to their environment and they're displaying dysfunctional behaviours, isn't that actually attributable to the environment that we as a society have created for them? So it's not actually their fault, the dysfunctional behaviours. It's actually, and I think we need to be doing something about it. But it's what we do, obviously, that we're all struggling to find. And maybe political lobby too, because I certainly hear, in terms of mental health, how long have I been hearing? Yeah, more money. We're going to invest in schools. I heard Anne Longfield on the radio this morning saying every school must have a school counsellor. Well, I've been hearing that for the past 2 years. When are we actually going to do something about it? And the political systems actually address the issues. That's key, and I don't know how we can do that collectively.
Well, we might think of ways of research collaborations that might really look at that, refusing the label. And there seem to be, we're talking about medical labels, psychiatric labels, diagnoses, and we're talking about labels, all the labels that we saw displayed in Delia's play, and the idea of the attribution of blame and the historical attribution of blame and identity. And in fact, that linked very much with the interdisciplinary research forum that we had last week. It was on diaspora and identity, national identities, looking at whether young people are another cohort, if you like, of young people are thinking about it very differently. I know I'm putting you on the spot, Don, but I wondered if you might like to say something. Is he there? Svetlana, would you like to say something? I'm sorry,
I think John left about 5 minutes ago.
Oh, okay, that's
yeah.
a shame. Okay, so, Svetlana.
Yeah, I think I think it's a very important question because it links to research on migration and diaspora, and what we find, for example, you know, my PhD student is doing research into the Turkish Kurdish community in London, and it appears that there are huge issues with mental health, in fact with suicide, which are silenced, and of course these issues are linked to but also to the lack of mental health services. So I think there's a very big area for interdisciplinary research here where we could collaborate very fruitfully, definitely.
So it seems to me there are quite a number of themes that could be very fruitful in terms of this, and certainly the diversity of perspectives that we've captured within our team of speakers, and there's a wider team supporting that, and also in this audience. I don't know if anyone has any specific ideas about some directions or research groups, or just blue sky thinking at the moment, but something that we can really develop.
Hi, yeah. One of the things I was thinking about is somebody who was trained in psychiatry, albeit that I was a psychiatric nurse, mental health nurse. I think the psychiatric model, let alone the medical model, lets young people down badly. But I also think that it's very convenient for the government to stick with the tradition of looking at psychiatric diagnosis, because it minimises the degree of suffering and it minimises the degree of trauma in terms of the statistics that are gathered relating to young people. And I think the shift has to be really from the kind of medical model thinking to listening very carefully, and that's about giving voice to, and it's also about us as professionals, as educators, thinking of ways of tapping into the voice and not judging but listening very carefully to young people. That might sound very kind of global and general, but until we kind of pay attention to people's, I think, suffering in a way, trauma might be the other word, then we're going to miss how people are struggling, and therefore we're not going to really understand well enough how to respond and help. But then there's a kind of socio-economic, educational, lack of educational drivers in society as well, which by the same token must be looked at radically.
Yes, that's right, because actually in one of the policies about 10 years ago, it was Every Child Matters, and they identified 5 areas of well-being. One of them was economic well-being, because we're seeing this in the COVID situation, how in looking at health, we're also economic deprivation is a source of trauma, mental poverty. Poverty is also an enemy, and inequalities. So in terms of looking at perhaps the school system, secondary school system, or we might look at the intersections between youth work and therapeutic work, which Anne has obviously combined in her one setting. So those systems, how they interrelate, but then the wider system, the wider national, the wider global system. How is all of this? Are we meant asking people, human beings, to fit those systems, and especially young people? And you know, so really hard. And say something, Myra, can you
hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for hosting, Christine. Very well done, and thank you for all the presenters. I think it is wonderful to hear, you know, academics and also practitioners working with young teenagers. And I myself have worked with young teenagers myself. And at the moment, I'm focusing on primary education in the sense with drama, kind of pedagogy based there. But I think it is important. But something to bring up is that as schools are, I think, we silence the children and we don't give them right and we don't give them voice. But, under the UN national conventions of the rights of the child, they do have a right, and they do have a right to speak and give opinion and thought. But what's happening in Western societies and in many other countries, they don't get the right and the chance to speak. And, mental health is something that is kind of shushed and silenced. Now and now more, it's coming up to light. But in my sense, I know we focus a lot on secondary education, the young of secondary. I worked as a drama practitioner teaching in secondary education, and it is important to reflect that young teenagers are going through really hard times. And, in the earlier presentation, it was, why is it not talked about? And so many things are happening. Social media is definitely a major influence in mental health for young teenagers, and suicides that are happening with the influence of bullying and social media and bullying at home and school. And that's something that is in the media. But I mean, of course, we have researching as of now, researchers looking into this. But I think we need to target, and this is just the view of what I see, is that if we work at primary education and having the voice of the child. Now the government in the UK encourages that under the Department of Education, giving the rights of the children to speak and give opinion. But I think it's, in a sense, certain students are picked to kind of say, oh yeah, yes this and yes that. But what I've seen today is focusing on the minority. And I think the minority, I come from a minority background, I'm Mexican American. So if the minority people can speak, young children or teenagers, we do discover more. And like I said, it is important if we start, I say if we start at a younger age. I know we start with secondary, but sometimes secondary education or secondary children maybe are a bit, I don't say too late, but all these mental health issues start, I think, at young age as well. Especially now, you got teenagers going into Instagram and Facebook at 12, 13, Snapchat. I mean, you have so many things now influencing younger children. I mean, we're talking about, year 4, year 5 here in the United Kingdom education. And so, but I do agree secondary is a great place to start, but I think it needs to be even taken even back further and looked at mental health in primary settings. And, but like I said, great job, everyone. And, and let's keep going with that. But yeah, that's just my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris.
Hi, sorry, I was just unmuting I couldn't agree more. I think my work at Great Ormond Street really opened my eyes to the capacity and the level at which you can integrate and work with young children and really get an understanding of how, whether it's a heart condition, whether it's mental health, whether it's whatever it might be, children have a great capacity to explore the language that helps us to understand their lives and the way they live their lives and the challenges they have in their lives. I think social media is huge. I sometimes I have lots of nieces and nephews, and I have a 7-year-old niece who posts TikTok videos, and sometimes sorry, stop it, sorry. And sometimes they're so sad, these TikTok videos, because they're often about how people haven't liked her post, that so and so said this, and they seem very minor, but when you actually then talk to her about it, they're quite devastated by the impact that social media is having on her. And that's just one child who's in, a very stable family. And you do wonder what the impact on mental health is having, internationally, nationally. It does blow your mind when you start picking at that. And that's a really young age. And I feel very passionate about what those younger groups are thinking and feeling with mental health.
Thank you very much. Emma Barber, you've actually contributed a great deal. And your last comment was, I think we listen, but we ourselves can feel powerless. So we need to see a part. So Emma, would you be able to say something about yourself and about the the session, and you've been picking up all the way through on relationships. Emma? No? Emma Barber. Okay, is there anyone else who would
So
like?
I just took my microphone off. I could just say that I sort of worked with mental health. Myself, I was a disengaged youth for certain. I worked with children when I was, disengaged young people as well. And it's been really good to, and now I'm sort of exploring education and what it brings, what it potentially could bring and what it does bring, and trying to sort of imagine a way that some of this could be, I don't know, people's mental health and education. I think they're really linked. And it's been really good to explore and go back to some of the work I've done before, and then link it up with some new things that have come into my life as I'm, a different point in my life. And it's been really, really stimulating. And I think that's all I could really say. And best wishes to everyone. And I would like to contribute further in the future with more discussions of this type.
So thank you, Emma. And could people just record things? If you have any idea for a particular research collaboration, what you particularly valued about the session, what you would have liked more of it. I mean, just if you could just put something down, because we're actually going to sort of summarize this and do a news article on it. And Svetlana and Maeva at our research office, anyone who wants any links from the session, actually it's up there in the chat section, and you can go. It's like rpo@londonmet.ac.uk, and Svetlana and Maeva will try and provide you with what you need, because we really need to continue. There's a lot of energy here, a lot of synergy, and it's just really how we move this forward, because obviously it's a vast area. So I'm actually going to, while people write things, if you haven't written it already, or perhaps your thoughts about how we can take this forward, can we go back to Olive, because you started us off with talking about the national policy environment, and you raised some really significant issues about gaps in data, about the way medical models, and so Olive, could you say something?
Yes, of course. I mean, I really enjoyed all the contributions, and it's really got me thinking more deeply than perhaps I was thinking before joining this group and before today. And I suppose the thing that strikes me, and I am a part of the psychiatric profession, if you like, although I've never probably been very mainstream, really. I think what I'm feeling at the moment is that that system is inadequate. It's broken, I would say. The data collection methods don't do justice or don't capture truly what we need to know about. And I think that maybe apart from the systems and the psychiatric care, etc., our research methods also probably need to develop and be different. One of the things, I'm having a tiny little dialogue here with Chris about tapping into social media, where people are making contributions that aren't being elicited by researchers. I mean, I personally am very interested in social media data. Blog analysis was something I was interested in, did a while back. But I think we have to kind of move into a new space, think about what's really important, capture the true voice of young people as early as possible, as comprehensively as possible, while also at the same time working on the broken systems. Now, that might sound like a bit of a jumble, but I hope it makes some sense.
No, that sounded amazing, and as a summary, a distillation.
Olive, I think it's the social media, like, because I'm across, I am on TikTok, and I am on Instagram, and I am on Twitter, and all the others. But I think TikTok is an absolutely fascinating, if any of you are on it or not on it, it's an absolutely fascinating social media tool, or it's something that blows my mind. Like you can, and please don't judge me on this. I have sometimes sat on TikTok for 4 hours, and it's 3 in the morning, and I can't believe the rabbit hole that I've gone down. And it could be anything from dance routines to people with amazing bodies to people doing EastEnders. There's a tagline that's funny, but it does lots of things because it feeds into whether it's our ADD minds, whether it feeds into our sort of body dysmorphias, whether there's lots of things it feeds into, which is absolutely fascinating about, for myself, I can be on threads where as a gay man, there are some amazing bodies on there that are doing dance routines. And after watching them for 2 hours, you go, clearly I'm slightly inadequate in this world. And that's me. And then I think, well, what are other people feeling and thinking, and especially young people with mental health problems that might be stuck on this with, eating disorders, depression, anxiety. Like, I think there is something here that is totally untapped on what that might be.
Thank you. Olive, you want to comment?
Okay, if I may just say quickly, I think they're really interesting ideas, Chris, and it's something that I'd love to collaborate with. You've probably heard of the qualitative methodology of photo voice. I was just thinking, TikTok could be used as a kind of more enhanced version of photo voice, where young people could be asked to record whatever they want, or maybe even given a theme, or maybe briefed or unbriefed. There are all kinds of different ways you can do this. But I think looking at the photo voice methodology, which anthropologists often use, I think there may be a very interesting way of doing an initial study and capturing a kind of a broad view of young people and their needs around well-being and mental health. I think that's definitely something that I would be motivated by and really, interested in. I love that sort of methodology where you're doing everything you can to put the focus on the voice or the opinion of the people who are having the difficulty or the experience, or whatever. So I'd be very keen to do something like that.
That's brilliant. Obviously, this is recorded. I don't know if you, and I've taken some notes, but if you want to write something as well. And Deanna, you've made a very interesting contribution here about looking at the different jurisdictions in the UK and their policy approaches. Could you say something about that?
Hi. So my background is political science, so I come from completely sort of politics and policy perspective, and I know from my work in Wales there are some sort of innovative thinking around how to frame particularly services for adolescent mental health. And in recent reviews that have been done by the National Assembly committees, they've pointed out the inadequacy of sort of current approaches to dealing with or helping and shaping the services to support adolescent mental health. And I'm sure that there are different approaches as well in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I was just thinking that perhaps this is something that ought to be looked at to see from a policy perspective how the sort of the discourse might have changed, how the different policy entrepreneurs have different channels of access now to structures of powers and influence. Because I kept hearing in these presentations, the importance of structures and the importance of structural inequalities. And I'm just wondering if anyone would be sort of interested in exploring a little bit more about whether or not the fragmented system of policy in the UK might be facilitating developing some innovative approaches to how we look at adolescent mental health from a sort of policy perspective.
Well, that's excellent, and because you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting suggestion as well, Deanna. I think, though, that because I think it seems clear from what's come out of the discussion today is that perhaps we don't have a proper understanding. And I think because we don't have a proper understanding, and the systems that exist and the data gathering methods that exist don't do a good job to help us to understand, I think that before we kind of look to service provision and responses and services, I think we have to kind of go back to understanding and the frameworks and the lens through which we try to understand young people and their mental health or well-being issues have been probably historically, and I think we're becoming more aware, are actually totally inadequate. So I think we have to concentrate on, initially probably, on gaining a much fuller, much more empathetic and much more in-depth understanding. That's why I think ethnographic methodologies and have a lot to offer.
Thank you. Can I ask Chinar, you've made some comments here about following up and also social media. So Chinar is a PhD student at London Met. Are you here still? No?
Yeah. Hi. I would be delighted to follow up. Yes.
You would. With yes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
That was the invitation. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So I wonder, Anya, would you just like to say something about the trauma recovery model?
Oh, hi. Yes, Christine. It's a trauma recovery model. I was introduced to it about 1.5 years ago, 2 years. So Dr. Tricia Scoos and Johnny Matthews, and they started off with, I suppose, looking at the presenting behaviour and the underlying need, the types of interventions and the sequenced interventions. And a lot of the work that they had been doing was with young people in care or young people in like a punitive setting, like young offenders institutions. And a lot of their work was around, that whole thing about listening and voice and recognizing, how young people will grow up in fear or distress and neglect. And something that I think all of us involved in youth community work and social work, looking at the types of intervention around things like stability and boundaries.